A lot of things happen in the finale. Cake gets to stay in her magic cat form, Little Destiny gets to stay in a civilized world with a toilet.
I am so moved.
And Simon and Fiona are both able to move forward into more satisfying lives. There's a lot to unpack in these final episodes, so I'm going to focus on what I think is most interesting about this show. The themes, narrative structure, and characterization centering on Simon and Fiona. A sense of unease with a dissatisfying and purposeless life has dogged Fiona and Simon throughout the series. Let's take a look at how they grappled with this theme in the end. Now that we've reached the show's end, we see callbacks to the opening episode, creating a feeling of symmetry, of returning to the beginning. Episode 9 starts with a dream, just like episode 1. This time, instead of being an uplifting fantasy, it begins as a fantasy and evolves into a nightmare, in which Fiona and Cake see people they know turn into deformed versions of themselves, including Gary, LSP, and Simon. Simon essentially accuses Fiona of being selfish. "Are you happy, Fiona? All this for you." Of course, I'd say we can safely assume this has nothing to do with Simon per se. Rather, this is Fiona's subconscious reprimanding her. Fiona and Cake wake on an ice rink in their ordinary world. Fiona is incredibly excited when she finds out Gary and Marshall are dating. Meanwhile, Simon the Lich and the Scarab are now trapped in Golb's mysterious eldritch void. The Lich states in the beginning that, "In succeeding I lost all purpose," and Simon starts to agree with the sentiment only to be distracted. Seeing Betty, he talks about how much he misses Betty and how he feels he failed her, summing up the gist of it with, "You've given me a second chance, and I've wasted it. I met two people who really needed my help," he explains. Fiona and Cake. "They'll use a second chance better than I ever did. I finally have a purpose now." This, of course, has been in the subtext for most of the show thus far. Simon's feelings of being a waste, his need to find purpose in other people, are finally made explicit. Shortly after this, the Scarab tries and fails to kill Simon. "I'm a professional," Scarab says, "and professionals don't hold grudges." Which is an ironic example of him lying to himself. He's built up a massive grudge. To protect Simon, Betty breaks Scrabby into little tiny scarab creatures which try a different tack, heading off to instead settle their grudge with Fiona and Cake. At this point in the narrative, the final conflict is set up. Now Simon has his final confrontation with Betty, and Fiona and Cake must confront the Scarab. However, these are very different confrontations. Simon still wants the crown, and Betty is interfering with his purpose. Fiona and Cake's case is more straightforward. Scarab just wants them dead. Before Scarab actually reaches the pair though, they're explaining the situation to Gary and Marshall, who wonder if they'd still be together in a magical version of their world. Fiona awkwardly tries to reassure them it'll be fine, but it's obvious she's wondering whether she has a right to upturn so many people's lives by reforming their world. Incidentally, I loved watching Fiona and Cake try to explain other versions of reality to Gary and Marshall, only for Cake to blab about the reality where their alternates tried to kill each other. Not the best way to reassure her friends. Speaking of friends, by the episode's end, a core team of Fiona, Cake, Gary, Marshall, and Hunter unite to fight the Scarab. Prismo, trapped in a cube the Scarab used to imprison him, is trying to escape to help Fiona and Cake. As for Simon, after he tells Betty he has a purpose, she answers the way only an inscrutable eldritch entity can. She transports his consciousness into the distant future, into the body of the adventurer Shermie. Certainly an unpredictable route to resolve his character arc. Simon gets Shermie's friend Beth to help him track down a book on the crown, so he can get the crown again. He finds a book about Casper and Nova, and realizes it's a holographic game book. He begins reading with Beth, convinced that this time he'll get the crown and fulfill his purpose. Episode 10 opens with Simon and Beth reading about the adventures of Casper and Nova. Simon is frustrated by the lack of progress finding the crown's location, and Beth chides him. "Simon, I know you're really into this story, but if you're not enjoying yourself, you can just stop." I think this line is an indirect way of expressing a key theme of the show, and I'll come back to that later. Fiona and Cake and their friends are still facing the Scarab. At this point, Scrabby is obsessed with two separate yet equally important goals: executing his job perfectly and destroying Fiona and Cake's world. As his rage builds, destruction becomes his focus. Cake frees all the entities the Scarab captured. Perry, the living island of insight, apparently is murdered by Scrabby here. Cake shapeshifts into a giant, but is pummeled into submission by the Scarab. Gary and Marshall take over the fight, only for the Scarab to speedily take them out as well. Seeing Gary and Marshall's relationship has already led Fiona to acknowledge good in the mundane aspects of her world. "Please, I take it back," she now says out loud. "I want this world." Simon, meanwhile, reaches the end of his book about Casper and Nova. Throughout their story, he realizes that he's taken only one pathway, the path of Casper, who is after the crown. It's at this point that he realizes why Betty sent him in to show him his body. In episode 8, we saw how Betty expresses her admiration of Simon's ideas, and they end up going on an expedition and finding the Enchiridion. This set the tone of their entire relationship, where Simon's goals and desires set their direction, and Betty just followed along. Betty is quite philosophical about it all, however. "We made our choices," she says. "We could have made better ones, but I don't have any regrets. You were a wonderful experience." And so Simon accepts that his life with Betty was not as perfect as he thought, and their relationship has ended. He was flawed, and so was she. The crown symbolizes both Simon's past and his all-consuming obsession. "You were everything," he says to Betty, which directly expresses how he allows his relationships with others to wholly define his identity. So we've reached the point where our heroes are finally able to surrender their maladaptive beliefs. If you've watched my other videos on this show, you'll have noticed my obsession with the hero's journey.
The man is mad, we'll have to humor him.
In that storytelling model, this part of the narrative is called resurrection. As Vogler notes in The Writer's Journey, resurrection often calls for a sacrifice by the hero. Something must be surrendered, such as an old habit or belief. The hero gains new knowledge on their journey, but it is in the resurrection stage that they incorporate that into a changed personality, often in a final, decisive confrontation with the villain, antagonist, or shadow. And so, facing Golbetti, Simon comes to a further realization. "I think I only offered to become Ice King because I felt my life didn't matter," he says. "But I'm really no less worthy of life than Fiona or Cake." Fiona manages to call Simon, and after she tells him they want to fight for the mundane world they have, he's able to let go of his obsession with the crown. Golbetti takes Fiona's world out of Simon's head, allowing him to give it to Fiona. Fiona is able to share pieces of her world with all its people. I'd say it's deliberately ambiguous and abstract what this actually means, representing Fiona's world as a glowing dandelion that can be scattered amongst its people. This, incidentally, is another callback to episode 1, when Hunter gives Fiona a dandelion and she holds it and makes a wish. Meanwhile, Simon flings away the crown, symbolizing his ability to release his past and move forward. And after this, he literally moves forward. He starts leaping through Golbetti's void, looking for a way to return to his life in Ooh. At this point, Ice King is dead, metaphorically speaking. Given that Ice King was the ultimate egotist, you could say that Simon had to be a little more like Ice King to find the balance he was missing. Fiona's world is on the verge of total obliteration when it is resurrected thanks to the authorization of her universe. It's not explicit what authorized it, but it seems that once Golb took it out of Simon's head, the situation changed. Fiona and Simon both make a decisive change during the final confrontation. Fiona rejects the magical world, and Simon rejects the crown. Only then do they turn the tide. This is not them simply rejecting all magic, rather, this is them rejecting their crutches. For Fiona, her dreams of a magical world are a maladaptive coping mechanism, a crutch she uses to make herself feel more righteous and important than she actually is. For Simon, the crown is an escape, a simplistic solution to his emotional pain by way of oblivion, surrendering his sense of self. Back in Fiona's world, even after being called off by his boss, Scrabby won't stop trying to destroy Fiona and Cake's world, but Prismo manages to send in reinforcements. This isn't just Prismo's doing alone, however. It's also a return of allies Fiona and Cake made on their journey, which aligns this roughly with the return with the elixir in the hero's journey story structure. As Vogler puts it, having survived all the ordeals, if they are true heroes, they return with the elixir from the special world, bringing something to share with others, or something with the power to heal a wounded land. The final battle ends with an Alice in Wonderland reference, with Fiona eating the magic food that makes her grow huge. It mirrors the dream sequences at the beginning of episode 1, with Fiona wielding a battle hammer, in this case Cake shapeshifted into a giant hammer. The series ends with Fiona and Cake living in their ordinary world, but some of the magic they found on their journey is brought with them. Cake, for example, uses her stretching powers to help rebuild the city. At the beginning of this series, Fiona thought pretty much everything in her world was wrong. By the end, she realizes she mostly needed a change in mindset. Fiona's last line is, "Just a normal world." Then, Peppermint Tank rolls past. While her world now has some of the magic she always dreamed about, she's finally able to enjoy the mundane. As I mentioned before, episode 10 opens with Simon and Beth reading about Casper and Nova's adventures, and Beth responds to Simon's frustration by pointing out, "Simon, I know you're really into this story, but if you're not enjoying yourself, you can just stop." We saw over the course of this series that both Simon and Fiona had created narratives about themselves that shaped how they thought about everything in their lives. Fiona's narrative was that she was meant for greater things and a greater life, and there was no meaning in her mundane reality. Simon's narrative was that he had failed the people who relied on him, and if he couldn't help others, his life was meaningless. Both characters can veer away from these narratives by the show's end. It's about as upbeat an ending as we could expect given the relatively dark themes of this show. Before we finish up, what about season 2? Will Fiona and Cake have a season 2? It's possible, according to executive producer Anna Muto. In my videos thus far, I haven't looked that closely at Cake's character, and that's because she starts the story relatively unempathic, and she ends the show relatively unempathic. A sympathetic trait is her loyalty to Fiona, who she obviously cares about deeply. If Fiona and Cake is renewed for a second season, there's room for the writers to create a stronger focus on Cake, and have her go through an arc that forces her to confront her flaws, change, and grow. Of course, we could have new characters, focus on someone else, like Princess Bubblegum. A lot of things are possible. I think this show has a lot of opportunity for going in all sorts of different directions. But that wraps up my thoughts about this dramatic finale. Now that Fiona and Cake is over, if you have any suggestions for future videos, let me know in the comments. I'm open to your ideas. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you to those of you who've subscribed already. Have a great week, and thank you for watching.